Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Philip Phillips, and I am the Associate Dean of the University Honors College here at Middle Tennessee State University. It's my pleasure today to welcome our speaker. Dr. Brad Bartel earned his baccalaureate degree from Brooklyn College in 1970 and his PhD from the University of Missouri in 1974. Both degrees were in anthropology. An archaeologist specializing in studies in colonialism, mortuary science, and early human symbolism, Dr. Bartel has conducted field research in Yugoslavia, Turkey, Ireland, and the United States. His research has been supported by grants from the National Science Foundation, National Endowment for the Humanities, and various other foundations. His research has appeared in numerous scholarly journals, including World Archaeology, the Journal of Archaeological Science, and the Journal of Field Archaeology. Dr. Bartel began his professional career at San Diego State University as an assistant professor of anthropology, was promoted to associate professor, and then promoted to professor, and also appointed the associate dean of the graduate division in research with responsibility over all the master's and doctoral programs. He served as the dean of the graduate school and associate provost for research at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, as the provost and executive vice president at Florida Gulf Coast University, and as the president of Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. He joined us here at MTSU in July 2010 as the university provost, the chief academic officer of the university. Today, we welcome Dr. Bartel as an accomplished scholar and look forward to his presentation on the development of the world's first town as part of our honors lecture series on the power of place. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bartel.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips, and welcome everybody. It's a great crowd for a dreary, rainy morning or afternoon, and it's a wonderful lecture series, so it's very diverse, and I'm glad that I've had an opportunity to be part of it. Today I want to take you back in time in two separate occasions, one going back in time approximately 9,000 years to the development of the world's first town, but also taking you back in time to 1971, because some of the things that we're going to be discussing today actually appeared in my first publication and in my first paper presentation nationally. So I used to work in Turkey, and this was part of my first bit of research as a scholar. So I want to talk to you a little bit today about how my thoughts have changed in the last 42 odd years since my first publication on this, and how new excavations have also refined our understanding of the development of the world's first town. So what we're talking about here is one of the most crucial periods in the history of human existence. This is the period of the transition from all people on the face of the earth being hunters and gatherers for their subsistence, living in small groups, to the transition to farming and herding. And this is the most fundamental human shift in history. And I'm not exaggerating about that, because this shift to farming and herding of animals has put into place all the current developments in human behavior, from the city life to high technology to the kinds of political structures we have today. So this significant transition that occurred time and time again in various parts of the world led to the kind of societies we have today. However, we don't have time today, nor is it part of the lecture, to talk about that critical juncture between the transition from hunting and gathering to farming and herding. That is maybe 2,000 years prior to the conversation we're going to have today. We're going to be focusing on a success story, namely the development of farming and herding with this group of sites in south-central Turkey. And you need to understand that the archaeological record not only is replete with success stories of the transition, but also numerous failures. When I worked in Yugoslavia, we found many early Neolithic sites that were complete failures. They had inhabited as a location sluggish parts of rivers, notably the Sava River and the Danube River, where these sites did not last long as early farming sites. Sedentism on the sluggish parts of these rivers contributed to malaria and disease, and these were not successful. So we highlight the successful sites, but there must have been, for every one successful farming herding adventure, numerous failures in this early time period. So today we're dealing with this area of Turkey, which is the south central part of Turkey. That's the island of Cyprus down there. And this is the area of Turkey known as the Konya Plain, which means horse plain in Turkish. And the site we're dealing with is Catalhoyuk, which is a site that's been known for about 50 years. And it is a critical site, one of the most important sites ever excavated in all of professional excavation. The site is located on a very broad-based plain. You see in front of you what's called the Eastern Mound, and here's the Western Mound over here. There's a double mound with a river running through it, and this is a site that is comprised of about 33 acres in size. Back in 1958, this mound site was discovered by a Scottish archaeologist by the name of James Millart. He then excavated the site over a series of years, 61 to 65. And then just in 1993, Dr. Ian Hodder, who is now associated with Stanford University, started a 25-year excavation campaign for the site. So it completes in 2018. As the archaeologists in this room know, to have a site that is open for 25 straight years of excavation is rather a rare occurrence. First off, who can find that kind of money? And secondly, to build up a team. And Hodder has built up an exceptional team where he has over 150 professionals, interdisciplinary, working on the site every summer. Their reports are delivered on time. There's an archive on the web of all their reports since '93. So this is the way archaeology should be done and needs to be done. There's also been a significant difference in the way the sites had been excavated between in the 1960s and the 1990s into the current time period that has contributed greatly to our knowledge. Today, the site is a major undertaking. They put an artificial roof over much of the site. If you've ever been to this part of Turkey, you could definitely see why you would need it. The weather conditions very hot. Also, we're dealing with mud brick architecture. You need to keep that in the shade, so to speak, and protected from the elements, or the architecture will literally melt and drain away. So it's absolutely critical that they have this kind of site covering for it. This site is on the UNESCO World Heritage, got its World Heritage designation in, I think it was 2012. And it covers, as I mentioned, 33 acres. The current chronology for the site dates it back to from 7400 to around 6000 BC. And then it has a population estimate, and we're going to get into this in a little bit, of approximately 8,000 inhabitants. And the key piece of this is that there's no other archaeological site of that population size anywhere in the world at that time period, nor do you have any known archaeological site even a few thousand years later of that population size. So this is an incredibly unique site in terms of preservation, size, and complexity. No other site even comes close to it anywhere in the world. So over the last 20 years or so, they've been excavating the site under a very systematic approach and technique. The rooms that they find are pretty standard, as we shall see. This is a 3D modeling of a typical room. The rooms and the whole site are made of mud brick architecture, which is very common not only in Turkey, but in Southwest Asia in general, and also in the United States. If you go and look at sites of the American Southwest, adobe architecture is the kind of walls that you build out of the local mud brick. These rooms that they have excavated have different niches, different platforms, different basins connected with it. The floors are plastered, the walls are plastered, wall art, preservation of material is of the highest type. Some of you probably want to know, how does a mound get created? There are different kinds of mounds. Locally here in Tennessee, we have mounds that are produced by just putting soil in the ground and building it up. Or in Florida, where I used to work, they have shell-midden mounds that are just a bunch of thousands upon thousands of shells building up mounds. This is a different kind of mound. This is a habitation mound where, because of the mud brick, if you want to redecorate, so to speak, all you have to do is push in the walls of your site, level it off, and build on top of it. And that's what happened time and time again at this archaeological site. A certain room or series of rooms would be used for a certain duration of time, and then when the walls collapse or in need of repair, all you do is really level it off and build on top of it. And so you get, you're living up here rather than down here after a fashion. And that's the way mound construction happens here. But these rooms are very, very interesting. They have antechambers, they have a main living space, they have plastered floors that have basins and pits in them. They have burials underneath the floors. They have ladders to get in and out of the room. So all entry and exit is going up into the roof, okay? And then they have holes and passageways between rooms as well. So it's a fairly standard situation, but it's an incredibly complex archaeological site to make sure that when you're excavating all the rooms of a given level and a given time period, because you have multiple levels. And the excavation that's ongoing as we speak is going at a much slower pace of excavation than the earliest 1960 excavation that kind of went through it very, very quickly. And this one is much more refined in its techniques. So this is pretty much a typical series of rooms from Building 77. In one corner is what we would call a shrine. It has plastered walls with horns, plastered horns on it, on the wall niches, and a platform. There are platforms here for sleeping, various platforms here. There are basins and bins. There's an oven, a hearth oven. And so that each space seems to be for sleeping, food preparation, cooking, communal life, religious life or belief system life, and storage facilities and antechambers as well. And wherever you excavate at Catalhoyuk, you find this type of situation. So it's an agglomerative site of rooms and buildings tucked together with entry and exit through the roof. Many of these walls have plastered wall art, either through actual kind of fresco-like art. Some of them have embellishments where there's plaster built up in a three-dimensional way with engravings and animal figures. They have handprints on the wall. Here's one of a very large Catal, auroch, wild bull, and then other animals around and people around as well. Some of these walls have plastered animal heads and horns and wall niches, and again, triple type of plasters. They have skulls with human skulls that are plastered. I mean, this is a very complex architectural site. This is an example of a plastered wall found in situ with geometric shapes on it. Some of these geometric shapes resemble carpeting. In terms of, here's another geometric design incised into a wall. Here's handprints. As you know, handprints are very common from all the way starting around 40,000 years ago in various cave sites for decoration. But you can see one of these plastered animal heads. The animal heads are cattle usually, or sheep and goat. And they also have wall niches in there as well. Here's an example of a corner so-called shrine built into the room with cattle horns built into a shrine. This is a kind of an illustrative decoration of what this would look like, typically. And you can see entry and exit through the roof with sometimes second stories and alike. Yeah.
So is it plaster over actual skulls?
Sometimes it's plaster over actual skulls. Other times it's just sheared plaster built up. Okay. This is, they have constructed model rooms in their local museum of what this looks like. Remember I showed you that big Catal one? And here's a typical wooden ceiling like you would have in a Southwest American kind of cliff dwelling. And then plastered walls and floors. Here's a little carpet down there and a platform here. Entry through the top so that the ovens used would have smoke going through the hole in the ceiling and ladders getting to the top as well. This is a reconstruction of what such a settlement would look like. The critical issue here is how do you compute population size for this? How do you estimate population size? There's a number of techniques to do this archaeologically. One is to take the square footage of the living space of the area, and there's a formula that's derived of the square footage by a divisor, and that could give you the approximate number of people in that living space based upon ethnographic analogy. Another approach is to count the number of sleeping platforms in the rooms as well. And a lot of these rooms have 4 to 6 to 8 sleeping platforms. So you could do it that way as well. But this is not too much of a fanciful reconstruction of probably what it looked like. A very agglomerative type of architecture where rooms abut other rooms. So you have party walls with other individuals within the town. You see the ladders, you see the roof-like ups and downs of the area next to a river. And again, when things get need of repair, they are repaired by collapsing the walls and building up on top of it. The problem with estimation of population too is that it makes the assumption that in any one level of this site archaeologically, all the rooms were used effectively. And based upon ethnographic analogy from Pueblo architecture in the American Southwest, we know that that's not the case. That often something on the tune of 10 to 15% of the living space may not be in use at any one time, and it may be reserved for storage, for grain storage, for example, rather than for living space. So you have to be awfully careful in saying that Catalhoyuk had a population of 8,000. You could be off by certainly plus or minus 1,000 individuals maybe in that estimate. But still, even if it's 7,000 people, it's still a lot bigger than anything else that's out there at that time. Some of you are familiar with other archaeological sites in the American Southwest that have a similar feel to this. And here at Mesa Verde National Park is the famous Cliff Palace site, about 170 rooms. A lot of these rooms are storage rooms. But a lot of them are domestic rooms. Some of the round ones, the kivas, are for religious purposes. But again, an agglomerative architecture with numerous rooms. The very famous Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon in New Mexico is another example of this, with agglomerative architecture, rooms right next to one another, right next to another. At Pueblo Bonito, some of these are 3 stories tall. And the round structures are these religious kivas. So Catalhoyuk's a little bit different in the sense that the religious functions are built into the domestic rooms. Here in the American Southwest, the belief system rooms, so to speak, are separate from the domestic rooms. But it's the same kind of agglomerative architecture with ladders. Anybody been to Mesa Verde? Climb the ladders to get in and out, right? So it's the same kind of getting in and out through ladders and going up through roofs sometimes and alike. And the best present-day example is another UNESCO World Heritage Site, Taos Pueblo, one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in the United States. And here, this is another classic example of a modern site that actually goes back a good 1,000 years of ladders used to get in and out and alike. So this is not an unusual type of architecture. And Catalhoyuk is probably the best and biggest example of it, but you can find examples like this not only in the American Southwest, but in the Near East as well. So the artifacts from Catalhoyuk are pretty amazing. It's not really the purpose of today's lecture to go over this because, but I did want to give you a feel for the richness and the complexity of the artifacts at Catalhoyuk because they are well preserved. We have preserved textiles. I think you might be able to see a little bit of the weaving here. A very famous figurine that was found in the excavation from the 60s that causes everybody a lot of trouble because, as typical, you find one of these types of figurines and all of a sudden you're making interesting comments about social organization based upon one figurine, and we'll get a little bit into this in a bit. But this is a female figurine sitting on, some people have called it a throne. I'll just call it a chair for the time being, and with flanked by feline type of animals and pendulous breasts, kind of pendulous stomach area, and they have alluded to matrilineal societies and power of females and alike. So let's just leave it as a nice looking figurine for the next few minutes until I get a little bit more into this. Here are other figurines that were found, animal figurines, some androgynous-like figurine, beads, a ton of beads, bone tools, stone tools, you name it, they have found it in amazing amounts at this site. For example, the figurines, we have over 2,500 figurines found at Catalhoyuk, which is one of the largest corpuses of figurines found at any Neolithic site. Why that's important is that when you have an assemblage like that, you can have a much more balanced approach to understanding what's going on here. The distribution is very typical of what I've seen at other Neolithic sites. We have those figurines that if you had to rate them as male or female, you could definitely say this is male or this is female. Then you have a whole bunch of figurines that I would just call kind of androgynous. You can't really tell what sex it is, but you probably know it's not an animal figurine. And then you have a lot of animal figurines as well. And so you have a whole host of different kinds of figurines. And they're made of a varied amount of raw material, from clay to stone. And this is the only one that kind of looks like this one. But what's really interesting is that when you look at those that are either male or female, and what do you want to call this one? You want to rate that as male? Okay. What is emphasized are the rear ends, the bellies, and the navels. They always have navels hanging out and big stomachs, but the genitalia are pretty much non-existent on both the males and females. So some have suggested that many of the human-like figurines are there to symbolically stress the importance of mature males and females in the society, especially mature females. So the genitalia is not the important thing, but the kind of largeness of the body is another thing. Not many people have alluded to pregnancy for these figurines, because in some other groups of the Neolithic of this time period, you do find figurines in Greece and Romania and Yugoslavia that have large genitalia as well, but these do not have that. So, and frankly, some of them could be toys as well. And I'm a big fan of the toy hypothesis for figurines, especially for animal figurines. And so that we need to take a very balanced approach because it's dangerous interpretation to start alluding to a matrilineal society or a patrilineal society or the importance of males and females in a society just based upon one artifactual type. So you got to be awfully careful, but at least we have, and the spatial distribution of these figurines is all over the map. Some are found in burials, some are found in trash dumps, so it's not like they're located spatially in one source or location. There's obviously a plentiful amount of ceramics as well. Most of them are pretty are like this, a lot of cooking pots for food preparation and eating. Not much in the way of decorative, although there's some ceramics that have just come to light that have faces on them as well. Not painted faces, but clay embellished faces in a three-dimensional approach. And then you have very specialized things where obsidian, volcanic glass, is ground and ground and ground to an incredible polish where you can actually use it as a mirror. And this particular obsidian piece was found in a burial, so that you can actually see your reflection in the mirror, of obsidian mirror. So this is kind of a specialized artifact that was found. Burials are critical at Catalhoyuk. They found close to 600 burials, which is again represents one of the largest assemblages of skeleton material from any early Neolithic site. So this is going to be critical down the road once the analysis is done about the importance of the burials in this, and to demark social organization. Almost all the burials are found under the floors of the residential area. So they are burying people and then digging them up again and putting more people under the ground, under where you sleep and live. And this is not an uncommon approach to mortuary practice. There are many societies in the past and in the present who do the same thing. So for example, this is just one building where they found a whole cluster of burials here, another cluster here, another cluster there. A lot of these, when they find them here, a whole series of burials disarticulated, because remember, they're digging these people up again and moving the bones and then placing a new burial into the ground with these individuals. So, and some of these burials have carbonized remains. This actually looks like it's actual brain material that has been carbonized. They find headdresses, they find people buried with objects, buried with textiles as well. So there's a very large richness of it. And interestingly enough, in Catalhoyuk, you find in the same deposits infants, subadults, which I mean by that, people who would be usually less than, let's say, 13 years old, initiation type of time period, all the way up to adults. You find both males and females. What I'm saying is that unlike some other prehistoric societies where maybe burial is only reserved for those who are initiated members of the society, everybody is found under the floors, even the infants. And again, there's no distinction between males versus females either. So this is a typical burial, flex burial again. At one time, the previous excavator, James Millart, the original excavator, he found a fresco on one of the walls of Catalhoyuk that showed vulture-like birds on the wall with headless human bodies underneath. And he was under the impression that what was going on in interpreting that fresco was that this society would leave their dead people exposed so that birds of prey could come in and pick the bodies clean and then bundle up the bones and then place them under the ground. Well, when you examine the skeletal material from Catalhoyuk, you find no scarring or marks of birds on the bones that would denote picking of the bones in that manner to dispose of the flesh. So that's not happening here in terms of it, but it was a pretty wild fresco, I have to admit, but it doesn't hold true when you do the microscopic analysis of the bone material. The other thing that's kind of interesting is this latest statement by the team excavating it. They've done some DNA analysis of some of the skeletal material, the human skeletal material, and they don't find in any given room a strong genetic correlation of the skeletons that are in there. And we're going to have to talk about what that means, if that's accurate, about kinship and social organization of this site. Because usually you would suspect that if you bury people under where you sleep, literally, that there's a strong ancestor relationship. That is pretty common when you have this kind of burial practice. So we're going to have to talk a little bit about that. Here's a typical disassociated set of burial material. In this particular pile, a figurine was found, for example. You also find headless bodies, as I mentioned before, and you find bodies that have red ochre, that you see the reddish tinge on the skull. And here's a piece of red ochre stone. So that red ochre is commonly used as a pigment at this time period, a reddish orange pigment. We would never have that at this institution, right? It would have to be some kind of blue pigment. Only at Knoxville could they have a red ochre pigment. But that's pretty common in terms of coloration as well. So, but what I want to talk about is something else. So you see from the artifacts and the burials that this is a very rich site. It's rich in number of rooms, it's rich in burial material, it's rich in artifacts, preservation is high. It has everything going for it in terms of a significant site, large population size and the like. However, there's some major issues that we still need to resolve about it. And back in 1971, I was privileged in being able to analyze the artifacts that came from surface deposits from village sites around Catalhoyuk. Here's Catalhoyuk, and then there's a whole string of these black dots, which are village-sized sites, 100 people, couple of hundred people, that surround Catalhoyuk. And no one had ever looked at those in depth to determine, well, what are those sites about that ring Catalhoyuk? And my analysis, when I compared in 1971 the artifacts from those village-sized sites to the original Catalhoyuk excavation results, showed an amazingly high correlation of similarity in artifact size, range, type of those sites. In fact, I analyzed a number of other sites that are around the area as well where there's a great falling off of similarity, so that those other sites are not, in terms of material culture, directly connected to Catalhoyuk. So what I'm saying to you is that Catalhoyuk has affiliated with it a whole string of at least 11 village-sized sites that ring around it. And then there's a falling off from these. In fact, these lines that I drew here show mathematical correlation tightness. So these two sites, it's like a weather map. These two sites here are together in one grouping. These three over here are another, these four over here, and these two over here. There are other sites further away that are affiliated with other larger sites in Turkey of the same period. But for this period of 7,400 BC to around 6,000 BC, this is a cluster of sites with Catalhoyuk being the largest, but it's affiliated with these others. And then you have to look at the region to know that further to the east is a big field of volcanoes and obsidian, and that seemingly is important to our story as well, because it's seemingly that when you do a trace element analysis of the obsidian from those volcanoes, it's pretty clear that they all come from a certain source, and that source is probably going to be controlled economically by Catalhoyuk. So what we're talking about here is, in terms of geographic theory, what's usually called a central place, a site like Catalhoyuk that grows and grows for some reason to become a very large settlement. And it controls village nodes around it. And they're all part and parcel of a unit that I call a supracommunity grouping, namely that it's more than just the site of Catalhoyuk. It's that site plus other sites that comprise probably some larger affiliation of sites. And as just a little interlude, you got to be careful. It's the same problem at Stonehenge. People concentrate on Stonehenge, and they don't remember that Stonehenge is part of a whole cluster of sites and monuments of the same period that together comprise a true sense of place from a religious point of view for the belief systems of those people who lived in southern England at that time. So just recently, in the last year, they found about 17 additional sites through using ground penetrating radar around Stonehenge that are distributed across the landscape. And anybody who's ever been to Stonehenge has seen interesting roads and processionals that work out from Stonehenge. So if you just concentrate on the monument of Stonehenge, you forget about it as being a cluster across a vast landscape of the Salisbury Plain of a number of sites that together comprise something. So just a little cautionary tale for you budding archaeologists that if you focus only on one site and not the entirety of sites, you're going to run into a heap of trouble. So the same thing with Catalhoyuk. You focus on an incredible site, a town-sized site, and you forget about how it's related to other settlements in the hinterland, and you've got to be careful. So, for example, there's a fresco at Catalhoyuk, a wall painting, that has this double mountain in the background that is visible from Catalhoyuk. This is where a lot of the obsidian comes from. And as you know, obsidian is volcanic glass. It's an incredibly great tool, sharp as all get out, and it's very effective in use as tools for drilling and scraping and alike. And the other thing that you need to know is that in terms of adaptation to the floodplain, all these sites, the village-sized sites in Catalhoyuk, are all located on the most productive floodplain soils in the Konya Plain. And this is not unintentional, that there's a reason why they selected these really wonderful floodplain locations for their subsistence. And the subsistence at Catalhoyuk is a very diverse subsistence. First and foremost, and it's something that we don't need a lot of anymore, at least in the West, is barley. And barley is seemingly the main crop at Catalhoyuk. Why? Because it's the most salt-tolerant crop. Barley is a lot more salt-tolerant than wheat. And therefore, in this kind of saline floodplain, you want to carefully select the kind of plants that you grow. And barley is by far the best, most productive kind of crop for this kind of floodplain. However, wheat, lentils, and peas also occur in abundance at Catalhoyuk. And then there's a great diversity of animals being exploited as well. When I did my research back in '71, I predicted that the number one animal would be cattle. And I think I'm wrong on this one. It looks like from the most recent excavation, sheep and goat are the number one. It's often, as some of you in this room know, it's very difficult to tell the difference between a sheep and a goat from the bones during this early time period, going from wild to domestic. So that we just talk about sheep/goat as a category. But look at the diversity of animals that are either hunted or domesticated and herded. So you have, these are the big two. But again, others are used, and there's a lot of mollusks used as well at Catalhoyuk. So there's a diversity of plants, diversity of animals. So the adaptation is to a fertile floodplain that had fairly unlimited growth potential. And that's one of the key reasons that Catalhoyuk probably grew to the population size it could. You're probably the first or one of the earliest sites located on the floodplain. You have the ability to herd large amounts of animals and grow large amounts of crops. The barley is salt tolerant. There's nobody else competing with you for resources. However, you've got to solve one problem, and that is what I call the auroch problem. And aurochs are the wild ancestors of domestic cattle. And these are big suckers. These are not small animals in their wild form. You know, the Texas Longhorn is probably it's a mini version of what we're talking about, but these are very large wild animals, and I'm sure that behaviorally, in the early first few thousand years of the domestication experimentation, this was not an easy problem to solve. However, the benefit of it is quite obvious. If you could solve the problem and being able to herd cattle in controlled ways, you have a lot of meat on the hoof, as it were. So that we're talking about the ability to feed large populations in this way. The analysis from sheep and goat, the microscopic analysis of dentition from the sheep and goat from Catalhoyuk show at least 2 grazing seasons probably for the animals, and some of the animals were grazed on grasses, others were not. That's in a preliminary version of analysis right now, so we don't know much about it. But certainly cattle and sheep and goat are the 2 major ones. So what are the characteristics that make Catalhoyuk a town rather than a village, rather than a city? And I'm putting village, town, city into a kind of populational and functional continuum. Certainly the population size fits. It's in the thousands. Is it 6,000, 7,000, 8,000? We don't know, but it's closer to probably 7,000 or 8,000 than anything else per level. Obviously craft specialization, people who are doing certain tasks and not others. Look at the Obsidian Mirror, look at the bead production, look at the textile production. It could be division of labor by male versus female. It could be division of labor by just people who are exceptionally good at one versus the other. There's a great diversity of subsistence to be able to feed a population of this size. Certainly the preservation of the artifacts go strongly towards a very culturally complex lifestyle in this town. There are certain things that do run counter to this. Usually when you define a town, you talk about either a symbolic wall or a true defensive wall around a town. No such wall exists at Catalhoyuk. The other thing that we have yet to find at Catalhoyuk is some kind of governmental or administrative building. No such building seemingly exists. Or more importantly at this early stage, for me at least, is some kind of building for a large-scale storage of foodstuffs, some kind of major storage facility that would then, if some of you have learned about chiefdom societies around the world, they tend to operate on economic redistribution of resources, where some kinship group controls the economic resources and then distributes it back to the people. And that, in my original model, that's what I thought this was about, Catalhoyuk, but there's no evidence to support right now the conclusion of any kind of centralized storage buildings for grain, for example, at Catalhoyuk. The other piece that's not known yet is how far back in time Catalhoyuk goes. We know it goes back to around 74, 7500 BC, but I predicted that it should go back to around 9000 BC, and it probably was the first settlement on that plain. But we don't have evidence of that yet. We haven't been able to dig down deep enough to find the origins of Catalhoyuk at that site. So that's still a big fat question mark. And then here's one of the big organizational question marks that has to do with the current director of the project, Ian Hodder, is claiming social equality at this site. He's claiming that males and females are equal in status and functions and division of labor at the site. He's basing that on the burials, where males and females are buried together. He finds no evidence to support the conclusion that that males are treated better than females or had a lifestyle different than each other. So we don't know. Remember I talked about the genetics of the bones from it? What would be the kind of kinship system that would promote a lack of genetic relationships between people buried in the same room? And you could have, for example, some of you in anthropology here know about moiety systems, where your whole society is divided into 2 groups. You're either in moiety A or B, and that has a kind of a loose genetic affiliation. It could be an ambilineal kinship system, where you can either claim descent from the males or claim descent from the females in the same society. But there's something really interesting probably about the kinship system at Catalhoyuk that is yet to be fully fleshed out, that could promote a generalized lack of genetic affiliations found in the burials, and we haven't figured that one out yet. I can tell you in my research later on for the Bronze Age in Turkey, from around 3000 BC, I proved conclusively that they had a moiety system in the same location. But that's 3,000 years later. So I'm not going to say that that is tied directly to what's going on here in the Neolithic. So my 1971 model proposed that Catalhoyuk was the earliest settlement on this plain. We don't know. They controlled resources, that cattle domestication was primary, that there was a collective belief system, and that some kind of chiefdom society with economic redistribution, and those other village sites around it promoted the concept of a supra-community grouping where there was an affiliation between the town of Catalhoyuk and the villages around it. After this latest excavation, the new model, we just don't know about it being the earliest settlement on the plain. What has really struck me about what's been found in the last series of excavations is that when they build a room structure on top of a previous room structure, they continue with the same kinds of shrines or religious sections of the room time and time and time again. So there seems to be a strong intergenerational belief system that is continued on and on and on through time, through at least 1,400 years of consistency of building their rooms with these niches and horns and plastering and shrine areas. That seems to be critical for the success of this site, namely that the entirety of the population has belief systems that are very strong, very consistent, and last through hundreds, if not thousands of years. Cattle seemingly is not the major domesticate. Sheep and goat are, so I was kind of wrong there. But we're still trying to find out about these other issues of whether there's some kind of economic redistribution. So if I had to put it all together today, based upon my research, based upon the previous and current excavation, I would say during this, probably around 10,000 BC or so, you start getting a society that are transitioning from hunting and gathering to farming and herding. They come with them existing strong belief systems. They are the earliest or one of the earliest sites on this floodplain. They get lucky. They find that barley, wheat, sheep and goat, cattle can all be grown and herded in vast quantities on this large floodplain without any competition for land or resources. That stimulates population growth, which forms town life, which forms craft specialization. I put a question mark against this box because I still believe we may find examples of economic control, like in the obsidian trade, or with storage of surplus grains. And then that will lead to a large town site with village nodes surrounding it, and the existence of a large supra-community grouping and central place for Catalhoyuk. So Catalhoyuk is the prime example of the Neolithic of rapid population growth, craft specialization, and being able to have a really solid adaptation ecologically to its floodplain environment. And that's the combination of factors that made Catalhoyuk the most successful, earliest town settlement in the world. And I'll leave it at that, and I'll take some questions. Anybody?
I'll continue being the annoying.
Go ahead.
So when you're talking about agglomerative settlement, so we're making assumptions about the use of space in the population estimates. So we're assuming that they're using space the same way that we do now, or that other places were using it then to make these population estimates. Is that right?
I think what's the way in which we're trying to estimate this by looking at the actual rooms. And when you look at one of these rooms, here's an example of one. You see these platforms? Platform, 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 platform. We're using those platforms that occur and reoccur as possibly sleeping platforms. And the size of the platform conforms to either the size for a single individual or maybe two individuals. And one approach to you count the number of platforms by size, and you come up with, per room, the number of individuals who may have resided at night in that area. That's one, and then we know that a related space adjacent to it is used for bins for just local storage, not these grand storage facilities. So we use this as a domestic and shrine zone combined.
Well, when you talk about the platforms, so one of my thought processes was, I know this is much, much later, but if you think about, say, pioneers in the West, in the U.S., you could have a whole family sleeping on one bed, or you could have mom, dad, mom and the kids on one bed, and dad had his own space.
Yeah. There's a lot of ways to compute this. I mean, some people start with just counting rooms and multiplying it by a nuclear family. Another approach is there's a formula in archaeology to take the square footage and divide it by a divisor that comes up with, based upon ethnographic analogy, what might be plus or minus one individual, how many people would normally reside in a room of that size if it's a domestic room.
I guess that was the ethnographic analogy. How do you make one for something that old?
Well, we use a standard set of tribal societies and chiefdom societies that currently exist, where we know the population sizes of their huts, their villages, their rectangular rooms that they use, and you can come up with a rough kind of model of what the associated population size might be. And that's why I mentioned how careful you have to be about this. You could be off by 1,000 people in the total population. Plus, it also assumes that all of these domestic areas are all used at the same time. So that's why I mentioned that as a caveat, to take it with a grain of salt. Even with that said, and even if they're off by 1,000 people, it's still by far the biggest settlement on the face of the earth at this time. So we're never going to get an exact measurement of this. Yeah.
So what's the prevailing theory on the collapse, if there is one?
Well, after it was used as a Neolithic site over here, they moved over this side, and this side of the mound was used in the next periods, what's called the Chalcolithic and the Bronze Age, and actually this is used all the way up to the Ottoman Empire. There's a Roman component to this mound, there's a Islamic component to this mound. So it's this mound that we're focusing in on, but the one across the way here also has habitation components as well that go up to almost modern times.
But was it just abandoned?
Yeah, yeah. And that's pretty typical. I mean, for whatever reasons, maybe the plain became too saline. But that happens all the time. So these mound sites have a use, in this case, at least 1,500 years. And then for another, then it's abandoned and they move on to a different location. Yeah. Question, yeah.
Does it appear that when they reconstructed that they moved the niches around for platforms?
It seems like, well, a lot of these niches were plastered niches, so that's easily redone again, kind of like you use drywall. And, but the spatial location of things continue time after time after time. So you will find that at these sites, a given niche area will be at the same predictable location below this and above this. Okay? Anybody else? Yes.
So the lack of genetic relatedness is very interesting, and of course goes against what most archaeologists believe about people buried together. Do you know if they've done any stable isotope analysis for strontium to look at migrations in of people?
They haven't yet.
Migrating from other places?
They haven't yet, and that's the next step I think they have to do. So it is troubling when you read a report that says that they find no genetic relationship between the people buried in a given set of rooms under the ground. Again, every other site that we know of, at least ethnographically, has some kind of genetic affiliation to the people who are living in the same settlement.
How close are they genetic within that area? I mean, within areas? I mean, are they, you know, if you go down pretending a block, are they the same, or is it, what are we looking at?
There's no results yet on that. But the interesting thing is that this part of Turkey becomes kind of a byway to bridging Turkey into other parts like Syria and alike, like it is today, into Greece. Later on, for example, during the Middle Neolithic period, there's a lot of cultural similarity in artifacts between parts of this area of Turkey and what goes on in the Middle Neolithic of Greece and into what used to be Yugoslavia as well. But at this period, there's more of an isolation there. There are other famous archaeological sites of this period that you probably know about. The site of Jericho is a very famous site that is a fortified small village at this time, but it has a tower and it has an external wall. And but it's a very small population size. It probably had 1,000 people. It's not 8,000 like we're talking about here. And there are a few other sites that are what I call maybe proto-towns, but this is a real town compared to the others. Anybody else? Yeah.
Continuing with the genetic diversity thing, has anybody explored the idea of it being a monastery or some type of, to me that would explain a bunch of people coming in with shared ideology potentially.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting comment. And you know, is Catalhoyuk some kind of specialized site? And is it something like where people, again, let's say a monastery, where there's no genetic resemblance, but they're there for a certain function or functions? And no one has ever explored that. But there are children at this site. There's sub-adults at this site. If you had only a site of males, all males, or of males and females, but adults.
But it's not uncommon for parents to give their children to, especially at that time, to.
Yeah, but not 8,000 people. I don't know of any monasteries at 8,000.
Many people know.
But I think it's really interesting you bring it up, because I think when you come to a conclusion like that, you really have to start weighing alternative hypotheses for what this is about. But I think it's very exciting information if indeed this is true about the burials. Yeah.
So is this genetic dissimilarity in burials consistent with the villages surrounding?
Those villages around it that I analyzed have never been excavated. Those are just based on surface deposits of artifacts. There's a new project based upon the Catalhoyuk project that will start excavating some of those village sites very soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.